Brett Okamoto, he has been breaking news about the UFC left and right, and there was more news broken today. Chad Mendes now suspended for 2 years, and Brock Lesnar also tested positive. And I'm going to bring Brett on in here. Brett, have you been sleeping? Like, I'm not sure, because I swear every time I turn on Twitter, you've tweeted something.
I've been getting at least like 2 hours a night, so I'm good.
You're good.
I'm making it.
All right, so let's start off with the headline news, which is Brock Lesnar. So we know he first tested positive. We weren't sure what it was because his previous samples had not tested positive. But then his fight night sample tested positive, and the news has come out, according to you, and I believe it was, who was else? The LA County Times?
Yeah, LA Times.
Right, that it was the same anti-estrogen drug that John Jones used. So talk a little bit about, the whirlwind that has been going on with this around UFC 200.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good word to use, whirlwind. And I don't know that I have a lot to add to you. Now it's like once this initial news comes out, then there's sort of a waiting period of, okay, so what are these guys, how are they going to respond? What is their defense? With John Jones, it seems very clear that he is going to say that he was taking a supplement that was tainted with this anti-estrogen agent. And with Brock, he's just said, we're going to get to the bottom of this. That's the only statement he's made. I have no idea what that means. I don't think anybody does. His team is going to put together some defense, you would assume. But 2 failed tests on 2 separate dates for Brock Lesnar, that's going to be it's going to be difficult to defend yourself against that.
Do you think this seals the deal for him officially making it a one-off fight?
I would never seal it forever just because money talks. And Brock Lesnar, even if he's found guilty of taking a banned substance, he's suspended from competition for 2 years, he would be 41 at the end of that time frame. I wouldn't think he'd come back and get into a fist fight in the UFC octagon. But again, I mean, if he has an opportunity to make, a boatload of cash and come in on a one-off, I could see him. I wouldn't rule it out. I would not rule it out entirely. But, of course, you hear this news, and you would think that, if anything, it would lessen the chance of him coming back.
I know you don't cover the WWE, but do you think this will affect his standing over there? Because we know that one of the guys over there, Roman Reigns, got suspended for using PEDs for 30 days. So do you think at all this might affect him over there?
You're right. I don't know much about the WWE, so I'm not the authority on this, but I got to believe no. I just don't really see, well, first off, whatever USADA decides, whatever the Nevada Commission decides, that has nothing to do with Brock's ability to appear for the WWE. It's not like he can't work for the WWE for the next 2 years. So, he's free and clear on that end. And then when you're asking, do fans care? Do WWE fans care that Brock Lesnar tested positive for whatever he did? I don't think they do, man. I think that they'll continue to purchase his wrestling matches. But again, I'm not a WWE expert, so you'd have to ask one of those.
Looking at the guy who he fought, Mark Hunt, there's been numerous reports coming out that he's demanding half the purse, the full purse of Brock, or he's going to, when he wants to be released from his contract. Some of it I felt was a little bit reactionary on Mark Hunt's part, but I can't blame him for feeling that way. What do you think is going to happen coming up with the UFC and Mark Hunt?
If he really is if he's having those conversations with the UFC, I could see the UFC trying to make it right. And under the drug testing policy that they have, they can actually fine Brock Lesnar themselves. The UFC can fine Brock Lesnar, and in this situation, it would make sense to fine Lesnar and potentially give that money to Mark Hunt. That's really going to be, in my mind, the only way Mark Hunt gets any more money out of this thing. I mean, he signed a fight contract for his purse. The Nevada Commission is likely going to fine Brock Lesnar, anywhere from 50 to 75% of his purse. It's a large amount. It's a substantial amount that the state of Nevada can take from Brock Lesnar's purse. But that money goes to the state. It does not go to Mark Hunt, unfortunately. And you can argue that it should, but the way the rules are written in the statutes, you can't argue those. I mean, those are ironclad, and we have to follow those rules. So the only way Mark Hunt's going to get more money out of this is if the UFC does something about it. And, we'll see. I understand where he's coming from as well.
We're talking with Brett Okamoto. You can follow him on Twitter at @BOkamotoESPN. He's one of the lead ESPN reporters. I wanted to ask you about the guy I mentioned earlier, John Jones. Now we know Lesnar and him both tested positive, kind of basically causing a lot of fans to be a lot of different opinions waving out there. People who are MMA fans, people who are not MMA fans. And now today the news comes out about Chad Mendes. So you have 3 named guys in mixed martial arts all testing positive for things that they shouldn't be using. How do you think this is going to affect the sport overall?
I think the biggest takeaway here is John Jones, and is this guy going to be gone for 2 years? He's going to come back and appeal, these substances being in his body. He's going to try and prove that, it was not something that he knowingly took, and he's going to try to get his 2-year suspension reduced. If that doesn't happen, you're looking at the next 2 years, no John Jones fights. And that, to me, is bottom line, the biggest deal out of all of this. When you're talking about the financials of it, new ownership coming in, having the UFC, you have a handful of stars that you rely on, and John Jones is one of them. So that's number one for me. In terms of Lesnar, we didn't really know if he was going to come back or not. So I can't chalk that up as a massive, massive loss yet, because we just didn't know if he was coming back. And Chad Mendes, a terrific fighter, he was going to take some time off as well anyway, because he was coming off of 2 knockout losses. But again, losing a top guy like him for 2 years doesn't help the UFC, of course. But to me, the big question when you're talking about the health of the UFC is whether or not John Jones is gone for 2 years. That's the big thing for me to key on right now.
Focusing on Jones, you mentioned the fact that he's going to argue that he didn't knowingly take this. When his agent and him had the presser, the agent mentioned that this was metabolites. And now all of a sudden we find out it's an anti-estrogen. I mean, those are 2 totally different substances. I think that kind of hurts John's argument that he didn't knowingly take something.
Well, I mean, to my understanding, and this is all like, you get into the scientific nitty-gritty stuff, and you got to kind of watch what you say, because none of us are experts on this. But metabolites refers to, traces of something. It refers to you're not necessarily, like when they say we found marijuana metabolites in someone's system.
Right.
That means we didn't find THC. We found just traces, leftovers of marijuana. So that's what he was referring to with metabolites. And it is true that I think the second substance that Jones tested positive for, in addition to the anti-estrogen, was a metabolite of something I can't even pronounce. Again, you're getting into the real scientific stuff.
Right, it's got like 14 letters in it.
But basically, the big takeaway for John is that, and the negative for John is that an anti-estrogen is something that you do normally take when you're coming off of a cycle of performance-enhancing drugs. So that's bad news, number one. Bad news, number two, is this guy has run out of second chances when it comes to the public's perception. Even if you want to believe him, you tend not to, because of all the mistakes this guy has made over the course of his career. So I think, it's not that necessarily his agent misspoke. It's a nasty situation when you're talking about what he tested positive for, and then you add in his history of shooting himself in the foot, and it's people are assuming he's guilty right away.
Brett, as someone who myself was an amateur competitor in MMA, I never went pro or anything, but I look at the sport and I look at now I work in the media, and I say, to me, I know it's going to hurt the UFC in the short term, but I feel like this is going to be good for mixed martial arts overall in the long term, because it's going to help solidify themselves in the mainstream with the rest of the sports, because they're holding up to the regulations that the other sports like baseball and football and the Olympics are trying to go by as well. Do you agree with that, or do you think that in the long term, we really shouldn't be focusing on that?
Well, we absolutely should be focusing on that. In the long term, is it good or bad for the UFC's business if they paid millions of dollars for an anti-doping program that occasionally removes some of its biggest stars? I mean, they really stepped out on a limb to do that, and I commend them for it, because I think a large portion of fans don't really care if these guys are on steroids. I see that on my Twitter timeline all the time. Oh, he popped for this or that. Well, good. I want my fighters juiced to the gills. I want the best fights I can on Saturday. You know what I mean? But you want it to be legitimate. And this sport is 50%, kind of WWE-ish entertainment and storylines, and it's 50% sport. And I really like the sport side of it. That's the side that I like to focus on. I like to think of these guys as professional athletes and not professional entertainers. And what goes along with that is a very stringent drug program. So I'm with you. I'm in a big favor of it. Do I think that the UFC probably occasionally wishes that they hadn't have implemented this drug testing program? Probably, but for the health of the sport, for the health of the athletes involved, and plus, I think the big thing here is that if a tragedy ever happened in the octagon, this is something we always used to say when the drug testing wasn't as good. If a tragedy happened in the octagon, and then it was found out that one of the participants was on a performance-enhancing substance, it would be devastating to this sport. So I think just from that standpoint, you have to have solid drug testing.
One more final question for you before I let you go. I really appreciate you, Brett Okamoto, joining us here on the Sports Bash on 97.3 ESPN. I wanted to ask you about the next two events for the UFC. You have Holly Holm fighting this Saturday, and then the Saturday after that you have UFC 201, where Tyron Woodley and Robbie Lawler are going to fight. What are you expecting from those two major fights, and what can we see, not just in terms of the fights themselves, but fan reaction? Do you think there might be a little bit of a downturn after UFC 200? Do you expect like the usual MMA and pay-per-view numbers?
Yeah, no, I think that there will definitely be a downturn. This is sort of it's not quiet. It's definitely not a quiet portion of the UFC schedule. They had an event last week. They've got one this week, and then you mentioned the one next week as well. So it's definitely still busy. But in terms of the fans tuning in, yeah, this is a little bit of a lull before you then have UFC 202, which I think will be just as big as 200 when you have Conor McGregor fighting Nate Diaz for the second time. But, these are good fights. I think this Saturday in Chicago, the intrigue is in Holly Holm. She's got a tough fight against a relatively unknown opponent in Valentina Shevchenko. I don't know stylistically if the fight's going to be a brawl. I think it's going to be technical. I think it's going to be something where you're not going to see a whole lot of action. You're going to see some cautious game plans between these two. So we'll see how that goes, but there's a lot at stake for Holly Holm. I mean, if she loses twice in a row, you're talking about going from the top of the world beating Ronda Rousey to now 2 losses in a row. So a lot of pressure on Holm. And then the next week, it's kind of the exact opposite in my mind in terms of the styles. That should be a war. Anytime you have Robbie Lawler involved, you're guaranteed action. Tyron Woodley has a lot of hand speed and a lot of power. So he has the ability to put Robbie Lawler in trouble. So that is going to be a phenomenal fight. But, yeah, I wonder how many people are going to pony up the cash to pay for that pay-per-view when they're coming off of 200 and then going into 202 next month.
You can follow him on Twitter at @BOkamoto ESPN. Brett, hope you get more than 2 hours of sleep tonight.
Appreciate it. Thanks, guys.
Take care.